Final Audio makes some pretty unique headphones, and there's a new one to check out. Let's see how they compare. This is the D8000 Pro, and this is the new Final D7000. We're going to do build first, and then we'll talk about their sonic differences. These are both planar magnetic headphones. Neither of them is cheap. They're both above $3,000. At the time of filming this video, the D7000 is $3,499 US. There are definitely some changes on these, not just the pads and padding, which is different. The D7000 is more like a soft fabric versus the D8000 Pro's leather. The same is true for the ear pads. It's actually notably more comfortable of a material. Doesn't get as warm on the head, but the other thing is these are a lot lighter than the D8000 Pros are. The D8000 Pros just feel kind of hard and heavy in my hands by comparison, and these, look at that, really get some air for the same amount of force. That isn't to say they're setting any records on comfort, but these are actually notably more comfortable than the D8000 Pro because of that weight difference and because of these more breathable pads. It just doesn't get as hot on my head. And it's hard to tell physically if there's more padding on top of the D7000, but it feels like there is. But it could also just be this softer material is a bit more compliant. Outside of that, they use the same twist lock 3.5mm cables that we saw before on the D8000 Pro. But when I take off the ear pads here, that's when the differences start to become a lot more obvious. Here's the D8000 Pro, and here is the D7000. They do not look related at all. I mean, this is a pretty dramatically different design under the hood, isn't it? And this design on the inside of the cup here is really interesting. I have never seen anything that looks quite like this in a headphone. It's also interesting, if you look at this from a side angle, this actually is a really thin driver assembly. I mean, the whole thing is recessed inwards just a little bit, but look at that. That is a pretty thin assembly, all things together. This mechanism right here for adjusting on the head is really, really smooth, as is the vertical adjustments, which seem to hold really well. All things considered, it is a really nice feeling headphone. I mean, as much as I don't love things being super expensive, this really does feel like its price point. It feels like an ultra premium headphone pretty much across the board, and it does a better job of that in my opinion than the D8000 Pro does. These also come with a really big carrying case, which is super nice. One of the nicer carrying cases that any headphone seems to come with. But we could talk about build all day. Let's get into sound and why these are different, but also where they're the same. You might remember my review of the D8000 Pro. I said these have pretty strange tuning, but they're really great for things like orchestral music, very detailed sounding, impactful in the bass, but just really wonky in terms of their timbre, which is how natural things sound. And honestly, the D7000 Pro is pretty much the same thing, but with a lot more bass. And the D7000 does sound a little bit better in terms of treble, but realistically, I think that's just because the bass is so powerful that you don't really notice the treble being a little bit wonky. What I can say is that if you are a bass head and like an open back headphone, this is like the bassiest open back planar headphone I can think of by a really significant margin. This is the most bass that I've heard in an open back planar. Now, that does come with a lot of warmth too, so it really depends on what you like. It definitely bleeds into the mid-range a fair bit. If you're listening to something like electronic music, it's pretty wicked. If you're listening to like folk or rock or something like that, it sounds kind of wrong. That's really going to depend on your personal preferences though. I still much prefer the D8000 for things like orchestral music, but if I really wanted to impress a bass head, I would put on the D7000 Pro and some tracks by Lorne, like Yesterday's Pain. Lot of sub bass, whole lot of bass, lot of bass. That is really what this is going to boil down to. Weird timbre, just like on the D8000 Pro, but instead of being the headphone for orchestral music, this is the headphone for bassy electronic music. And that's pretty much it. I personally wouldn't really enjoy it for almost anything else, but if that's right up your alley, I can't think of anything else that does bass quite like this. Now, that's too much bass for me personally, especially where it gets into the mid-range, but it seems like Final's really good at making very, very purpose-built headphones. Again, like the D8000 being pretty much exclusively a headphone that sounds like live orchestral music, and the D7000 being a lost artifact found in Lorne's basement used to conjure bass. Let's take a look at the frequency response and you will see what I mean. Here's the D7000 Pro in blue and the D8000 Pro in orange. What did I tell you? Both of them get pretty weird in the treble. Everything above like 1500 hertz, you start to get that dip that recesses until about 3K where it hits its lowest point, which is kind of weird because that's like the middle of the ear gain. Then our treble starts to rise back up. It's a little bit less jagged on the D7000 Pro. D8000 Pro gets way up there around like 9800 kilohertz and then starts to roll back down. It makes them both sound kind of dark bright, and that's why the D8000 works so well for orchestral music. You get that kind of bite that brass has on the end, but still a bit of warmth, a bit of space because that interesting recess around 3K. But the D7000, if you look at the raw measurement of it, it looks a lot like an AirPods Max in the treble. It's like if you took AirPods Max, made it into an open back planar, and then gave it more warmth and more bass. Pretty strange. Now, given there's people who really like the Max, and given there's a lot of people who really like bass, I think there will be plenty of people who like this headphone. I am more of someone who seeks balance in what I listen to, and it's not the sound for me. But I would be lying if I said there's people out there who aren't going to enjoy this. In fact, there's probably people who are going to enjoy it a lot. If you had to pick between the two and you like the sound more on the D8000 Pro, I mean, me personally, I would almost just get the D7000 and just EQ it because it's lighter. And if you pull the bass down the D7000, they're pretty similar across the rest of their frequency response. Though I get not wanting to use EQ because it really is kind of a pain. With the D8000, when I used it a lot, I did EQ down the treble a little bit and brought up that middle ear gain. But if anything, I think the difference between these two headphones is that the D7000 is going to cater more towards a niche, a bigger niche, and that's, again, people who love bass. Now, they're not super hard to drive. I could drive either of these just fine single-ended on the topping A90. I could drive either of these to a happy level on the JDS Labs Atom. I don't see any point in putting them on tube amp because they're both planars and they have linear impedance, though you certainly could, and I think it's probably time to wrap this video up. If you have any questions, something I didn't cover in this comparison, leave it down below in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. Like the video if you liked it. If you want to get active in the community, you can hit the Discord or the forum, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Till next one, guys. Peace.